dance and electronic music, I'm probably going to hit a few nerves saying this. I think it's one of the laziest genres in the world when it comes to general release strategies and marketing.
Welcome to your weekly elevation, your dose of real strategies for real results in dance music. I'm Olivia, and today's conversation is with someone who's been behind some of the most successful release campaigns in electronic music, period, full stop. Dan Roy Carter has seen the industry from every angle, from working with Spotify when it was just a team of 50 people, to managing marketing for artists like Avicii and Tiesto, to leading TikTok's music marketing division for the UK and EU before starting his own company. His career spans the entire evolution of digital music marketing, giving him a perspective that very few can match. And what makes this conversation so valuable, so juicy, is that Dan didn't just share theories. He broke down exactly how release strategies have changed, what's working now, and where most dance music artists are leaving money on the table. From the death of the 6-week teaser campaign to the dangers of platform dependency, his insights challenge conventional wisdom about how to market music in 2025. So whether you're preparing for your next release or rethinking your entire marketing approach, this conversation offers a blueprint based on years of working with both major artists and independents' success stories. Let's dive in. I'm excited to dig into this because from what I've read, you have a music journalism background and then transitioned into marketing. And as someone who's a former TV reporter who also got into marketing, I'm very curious about your transition.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a lot of people's story. It's a poacher turned gamekeeper kind of scenario where I started really young as a journalist, sort of 13, 14 years old. And I just sort of kept having these opportunities to get into places that not many teenagers were getting the chance to go and work, like basically with music publications and newspapers over here in the UK. And by the time I went to university, I felt like I'd gotten a lot of experience and enough experience to work out that actually long-term journalism probably wasn't for me, but there were things that were happening adjacent to journalism that were really interesting. And my whole background other than journalism was music. I played guitar and drums since I was 10 years old. I was in bands growing up. I was around a lot of the local scenes here in the UK. And I guess somewhere along the line, I just went, right, I'm picking up some transferable skills here that I think are going to be really useful to music. And I think I spent most of my teenage years working out what that red line between them was. And somewhere around university, I really found this opportunity to bring them together. And I had the opportunity to work with Spotify as a contractor, which was hilarious because back then I think it was a team of sort of 40, 50 people globally. I mean, it was very small compared to the behemoth it is today. But yeah, that was the first time where I was like, well, hold on, I'm actually getting paid to do something now in a far more sort of like business corporate environment. And around that same time, I got knocks on the door from like Tiesto's team and Steve Angelo's teams. And then suddenly I was like, hold on a second, people are actually paying me for these transferable skills and insights and such. And so it was a really nice escalation. I don't feel like at any point I sat down and said, right, this is my 10-year plan. I'm going to go from A to B to C to D. It just rolled. And I think it set the precedent for what has been the fuel for most of my career, which is just being at the right place at the right time, treating people well, and being a sponge to the knowledge and the insights that you're given. And what I found very quickly was that I was in these rooms having these really, behind the scenes chats about people's label deals and people's management structures and all the trials and tribulations that were coming with that. And so it was kind of hard not to get excited and not to get involved in the business from that perspective. So I never really aspired to work in the music industry, so to say. I think it kind of just sort of put its arm around me and said, hey, kid, come with me. And from there, I was hooked, to be honest. And I'm sure you can relate as well. When you love an industry and you feel that, or you get swept up by that duty of care for something, it's a lot easier to just bite down and say, right, I'm going to be a sponge. I'm going to work my ass off. I'm going to really integrate myself. And I had the opportunity to do that, and not many people get that. I so often hear these stories of people saying, "Oh, I'm trying to get my break in music, and I've never found it, and I've never got it." And for me, I've just never had to relate to that story because I just was at the right place at the right time, and that has continued. I'm in my mid-30s now, and it continues to happen. So I don't know. Maybe I'm just a very lucky person. It's less talent and more luck.
Well, no, I think, first of all, I think having journalism roots conditions you to ask questions, a lot of questions. And you said multiple times being a sponge, it's so important. And it's like, I think because it is very common advice, it's something that people overlook. But just this past week in Miami, I sat down with so many different artist managers and PR reps, and I was just asking a million questions, not for any sort of like, I didn't have one single goal in mind, but I was just like, I just want to know, like you were saying, everything about the industry, the ins and outs, because down the road, I know it's going to connect for me somewhere and potentially lead to an opportunity. So I think that's really important for artists at any stage to just be a sponge, like you said. So, wow. So you started when Spotify was in its infancy, and then you did some work at TikTok. Is that correct?
Correct. So I was very privileged to head up the UK for all things marketing and promotions for 3 years. So I worked across the UK, most of our European desks, and then also a lot of back and forth with our US teams as well. So that was 2021 through 2024 for me. Some
Wow.
kind of crazy years for the platform, I think, as well. And the first time I've been directly involved with a platform. I've worked adjacent to platforms. I've worked with the people at platforms for like decades now. That was the first time I think I really solidified my empathy for people behind the scenes like that. And I think, Spotify is a great example. Everybody that works at that platform is in such high demand. And I don't think people realize just how much pressure there is to be accessed and to be sort of lent on and to be sort of seen to support people. And I think anybody that goes into those companies, such as TikTok, in a music role, and I'm sure it's the same as well for the people that work in sports and entertainment and other things, when you go there because you want to empower that particular vertical on the platform, and everybody wants a piece of that. Everybody wants the best practices. Everybody wants a boost up. Everybody wants help, and you want to help everybody. You want to educate everybody. You want it to be the number one destination. The challenge is the volume, and I was lucky. I got to be quite anonymous for at least 50% of my time at TikTok. I think it was only the last year and a half where I was a bit more partner facing and working far closer with our label partners and independent artists and the like. And so then I really felt it and saw it. And I'll be honest with you, for my character, it wasn't the comfortable place. I much prefer being behind the scenes. I'd rather be able to walk through the crowd and nobody knows who I am. Nobody cares who I am, all of that. And I think when you go to those platforms, that dynamic changes, and everybody with the best intentions wants a piece of you. And I think, again, it's just when you look at how much of a boost TikTok received, both from an audience perspective and from a sort of musical lean-in perspective during the pandemic, and how people were very keen to sustain that. And for me, the task was like, can we sustain it? Can we build an ecosystem where people understand what they need to do for their music to win on this platform? And I'm very proud of what we managed to achieve, to be honest. And I think I'm very proud of what we managed to achieve. And I don't think anybody at TikTok would mind me saying this, but it's a tech company. It's not a music company. So when we're going and trying to get something that is for the better of the music industry across the line, we're having to persuade people that are sort of ex-Uber, ex-Tencent, people that really don't come from a place where they just want music to win or they want the industry to win, right? That their metrics and their verticals are so different. And so I think the challenge was trying to find a way to communicate the needs of the industry to the people higher, far above even my boss's pay grade, and to keep their attention and focus on the things that mattered. And I think we did. And I think, during my tenure, there were some huge moments. I think like the work that my team and the partnerships teams did on like Charlie XCX and the Brat campaign, for example, I feel like that was just a huge win. And similarly, we got to get involved with the likes of CR2 Records and what was going on with Matt Cesari and his just insane growth across the platform, and then looking at how that trickled down to their growth on Spotify as well. I mean, just coming away with tangible examples where the platform was able to really empower people and music on the platform. And I think for me, there were a lot of wins in that respect. And I think music continues to win on the platform, but it's quite sobering I think when you do go into the platform and you see behind the scenes and like really work out like what the pressure is to keep music growing as a vertical on the platform.
So that's what I was going to ask next. What surprised you most about music marketing with TikTok, specifically working within a platform instead of adjacent?
I think what surprised me was that the science wasn't particularly difficult, especially when it came to promoting music. And I think if we use creator marketing as a pure example, right? There are only so many ways to have a viral moment on TikTok. You generally have to, identify or nurture a trend using a piece of music and a content vertical or a content concept. You then have to amplify the best performing, sort of examples of that. And then from there, you work out how you then hyperdrive that and really translate it into the streams. And, there were only so many ways to do that. Keeping the industry's attention span and actually getting people to do the work, that was the challenge. I think a lot of people assumed it was as easy as flicking a switch or delivering one content concept or hitting one viral trend, and then the rest went into autopilot. And I think the other frustrating part from my side, and I say frustrating in the nicest possible way, but trying to get people to differentiate how their music is used and exploited on the platform versus how their own brand is grown and built on the platform. And I've said this several times, like, at ADE especially, it was a big part of the panel I gave. It was, you need to have two strategies that talk to each other, right? What happens with your music and the way people use your music can have a huge impact on how it streams. But those same types of content or those same sort of tricks that people are using there may be completely wrong for your brand and may be completely wrong for how you're trying to position yourself in the market. So you need to have those two separate things so that if that one record does go viral because of a bunch of like weird cat videos, just as an example, or something like that, you aren't the cat guy. It's just that record ticking along, doing its thing. You reap the benefits of that going viral, but your own brand has its own thing going. You can still set those parameters and protect that. And I didn't see a huge level of diligence in that respect. And I think sometimes maybe people, I don't want to say regretted it, but went into these things assuming that one would fuel the other and vice versa. And again, I don't think there was ever a precedent set that was the case, but that is a tale as old as time. I think people will often want shortcuts rather than long-term solutions. And I think it was always on me and the teams I worked with to say like, hey, look, this is one route to do that, but it will by no means take care of that. And if you wanted to, grow this as well, then here's something else that you can be running adjacent or things that you can be doing adjacent to that. And so everybody wants a one size fits all, right? And there simply isn't. And it is so nuanced to territory, to genre, to like the stage you're at in your career as well. And so I think trying to get people to understand that, for all intents and purposes, there wasn't just a button to be pushed. It really did have to be a little bit more strategic than that.
Quickly, I want to talk about your transition out of TikTok to now launching Carter projects. So talk to me about that and the gap that you're filling.
Absolutely. I mean, Carter Projects was really just my response to the market at the time and to the conversations I was having as I decided to leave TikTok and went into sort of working out like, right, how do I serve the artist and label simultaneously best? Because, there was so much demand for marketing direction. There was so much demand for commercial strategy and sort of working out how you get it right so that you're actually treating your marketing and promotional efforts as part of the wider business strategy and as part of your revenue strategy, because realistically speaking, anything you're spending should be in relation to what you know or what you can project you're going to make on the other side through streaming revenue and other revenue sources. And so it's kind of just a culmination of all the skills I've picked up along the last 18 years and really bringing that together. And truth be told, I've been absolutely spoiled with a gorgeous roster from the outset in terms of, the people that I get to work with now. And yeah, for me, it's twofold. Carter Projects, it really is just sort of me being there somewhere between sort of a marketing director, a commercial strategist, and a stepdad to a lot of these projects, because sometimes they just need a father figure to come in and put their arm around them and say, hey, I got you. It's all good, even though they're not mine, right? And that, I quite like that dynamic. I like being a trusted pair of hands in a sometimes quite unreliable industry and field. And I think that has served me incredibly well, especially over the last sort of, let's say, 10 years. Adjacent to that as well, it's meant that I can start investing in markets and areas that I really am passionate about. And so adjacent to Carter Projects, I've also got World Go Round, which is just a new label and artist collective that I'm building as part of that. And, we've signed some amazing artists in South Africa, Zimbabwe, the Netherlands, some here in the UK as well, sort of, 2 years worth of releases. And what I've loved about that is being able to take all of the knowledge of working both in the major label system, in the independent sector, across platforms now as well, such as Spotify and TikTok and the like, and then taking all of that and saying like, right, let's just build something sustainable for you. Let's not chase any of these one-offs. Let's not make this anything about like, right, those people across the road are doing that, so we've got to do it. Let's find the release cycle, let's find the marketing strategies, and let's find the exploitation strategies that suit you. And then let's give back to these communities that you come from. Because, being sort of half South African as well, I've seen how enthusiasm for the South African market has been great. The export potential has been great, but I don't think there's a lot being given back to those communities and also to that country. And I think that's fundamentally wrong. I'm not here to lecture anybody. I'm not here to tell anybody how they should or shouldn't do their business. I get to lead by example, though. And so I'm going to work with these guys in South Africa and in Zimbabwe. And I'm going to make sure that we make studios accessible to up and coming creatives out there. I'm going to make sure that we educate the music sector out there and give them as much support as we can. Because if we aren't giving back to the communities that we're taking from, then, I'd argue, what are we doing there? Full stop. So I feel quite privileged in that I've had this opportunity to build a company where I can pick and choose who I work with and the level at which I work with them. It's all very exciting. We've got an amazing project going at the moment with Jax Jones. I think he is about to do something and have a chapter in his career that I think people are going to be talking about for a long time. And I admire him for having the guts to do it. And I think the single we've just had out with him, Rebecca Black and Suyan, speaks for that. And what a great journey he's on. Similarly, some stuff that I won't name drop just yet, but some record labels that I get to work with in the dance and electronic space who, again, are looking at what they want to stand for and where they want to be for the next 10 years and actually taking action to sort of build and empower their teams to deliver on that. And I just love it when people come together and say, hey, we're doing well, but we can do better, so let's one up it, because it's very easy to coast in this industry. And what I'm grateful for is that some people are saying like, hey, Dan, we want to be different, we want to do better, and we want you along for the ride. And that's a huge honor for me.
Wow. So you've really, you have been in music since the beginning of your working age days.
Time. No, yeah. It's been a while.
That's incredible. That's a rare thing. And it's a pretty amazing thing, because you have just so much long knowledge backwards and forwards of where the industry was and where it's going. So how would you say a release strategy overall has changed since your days of working, back when you were working with Avicii compared to now in 2025? What's different?
It's a good question. And I think there's no one answer to it. But I think if I was trying to generalize, I think it's more that you're fighting attention spans now. I feel like the attention span and the retention of information is so different. So where back in the day you would tease a release for 6 weeks prior, now I just don't think there are many people that can get away with sustaining anyone's attention for that long, even at the top level. I think that has changed. Music consumption, for better or for worse, has become a bit like Tinder, in that you have that split second to get swiped right on. Otherwise, they're on to the next thing. And so as a result, I feel like, we're in the attention economy. Now, that's a shame at times, because what I'd rather do is have people actually stop to understand what an artist is bringing to the table, or where a record fits within their community or within their lifestyle and such. And I think there are still opportunities to do that. But when it comes to setting up releases, I think we're playing a sustained game where we want to keep each artist in focus and each record in focus for long enough for it to be discovered by the right audience. And most of the conversations that I'm having with people are essentially then trying to work out, how often do I need to release? How often should I be releasing? And there's two answers to that question. It's more, how often should you be releasing? Well, you should be releasing as often as makes sense for you, as often as you can without like a sort of skimming over records and meaning that they don't get the attention they deserve, but then also giving your audience enough that they crave. And different audiences are quite different in that respect. You know, you can have some audiences in the sort of, you know, the lo-fi hip hop space, for example, who are such passive listeners and will essentially consume your music without any real understanding of who you are as an artist, what you stand for. If you're part of a reliable ecosystem, be it playlists or, you know, streaming or whatever, that you just fit into that. Whereas there are other people who want to know what you're up to. They want to know what clothes you wear, what brands you fuck with. They want to understand what you're doing when you're not making music. And so there's different types of fandom that we have to cater for nowadays. And I think dance and electronic music, I'm probably going to hit a few nerves saying this. I think it's one of the laziest genres in the world when it comes to general release strategies and marketing. I think that for most people, they think that some DJ servicing, a push-up radio, and a couple of social media posts is enough. And, you know, then God forbid they get a couple of playlists, they've overachieved. Now, to me, that is wrong because dance and electronic music are so culturally rich, and you look at the heritage of it, you look at like how the Detroit techno movement started, and I think even to some extent the little era that I got to jump in on where EDM started being taken really seriously and where we were able to market and promote these artists in the same conversation as pop artists and at the same dynamic. And I mean, I remember the day my mum called me, she'd been on the London Tube with one of her colleagues, and we'd had the Swedish House Mafia at Milton Keynes Bowl. The posters were all over London. And she called and said, "Don't you work for those guys called Swedish House Mafia?" I said, "Yes, Mum. Why is that?" "I just saw your poster on the London Underground." And she couldn't believe it because as far as she was concerned, I was just working for a bunch of DJs. And now here we are selling out Milton Keynes Bowl. And that dynamic shift. Now, every artist deserves that moment. I think every genre deserves that moment. Maybe not every artist, but they deserve the chance to aspire to that. And you should be marketing your music with the assumption that it could get there, right? You cannot make any assumptions based on where a genre is currently, right? I have had, you know, projects, and I won't name them, who I've been told were going to be the next biggest thing. And then you've never heard of them again. And then similarly, you have these people that seemingly do it by accident, from an outsider perspective, I should say. And a great example of this actually is a record that I was privileged enough to work on with Shermanology, Boys in the Club. And
I love them so much.
I've seen you at the shows, and I know Andy doesn't mind me talking about this now, and that because at the time, I remember when he reached out to me saying, "Dan, I want you to come and run the label and launch the label for us. And we've got this record, Boys in the Club." And I remember listening to that record and saying, "This song is incredible." And maybe I joke, you know, every single label that they played it to had said, "Hey, we're just not feeling it. It's not the right sound." One label who passed on it later emailed me to see if they could sign it after they'd heard it on BBC Radio 1 and seen all the great work we were doing. And I very proudly told them to fuck off because quite frankly, the work had been done by a bunch of people, a very small team who believed in the record with a shoestring budget that we really put to work and the right connections and the right cultural triggers at the right time. This was during the pandemic as well, keep in mind. So we couldn't exactly go on tour. We couldn't exactly do much around it. So we had to be really resourceful. It's up there with, I think, their second highest streaming record of all time now. And they own 100% of the master because we did it independently. And they can keep that catalog and they can do it on their own terms from here onwards. And I love that. Those are the stories are what makes me want to release and market music. The fact that you can do it like that. But then at the same time, I can have great working relationships and conversations with the teams at Universal Music, for example. And, you know, a lot of my roster are at Universal. And I don't believe that it's you should do it independently. Majors are bad. No, majors aren't bad. Majors have a huge part to play for some projects. But it is also possible to do it yourself. And I think that's the other conversation around releases people need to have. What do I need to release? And what do I need to actually get this out to the right audiences? So it's, a loaded question.
Yeah, totally. Don't know. I mean, this is not a 1 hour conversation. This is a continuing conversation. But that's such a great story and tidbit. I did see that you work with Shermanology, and I'm just I'm their number one. That's where I was on my birthday this year, was at their show. So I love hearing that backstory. I am one of those people. You were talking about how there are fans who want to get to know the artists that they listen to and what they're doing and the brands and the clothes and whatever. I am one of those people, which is of course why one of the reasons I started this podcast, because I have the privilege of getting to know artists on a deeper level. But yeah, I really connect with Shermanology and their personality and how they come across on social media. So that's amazing. So we talked about what's changed. What marketing fundamentals have stayed the same since your, entry into the industry?
Taking the time to understand who you're marketing to. I think that's one of the places that I see people skimping so often. There is no excuse between like the default analytics that people are given access to now through their social media channels, through Spotify, through Apple Music, through all of this. You still need to start with an end in mind, and you always have a baseline to be able to see like, right, where does my audience exist currently? Where are there any markets that are starting to prop up that actually with a bit of investment and a bit of, TLC, we could impact more? So I think the fundamentals of that don't really change. You need to start with an end in mind. I don't think you should just be casting your net, far and wide. I think a global picture has to be fragmented into sort of like micro strategies. Quite frankly, I think that, you look at how labels traditionally did it back in the day. It used to be that you'd have a different licensing partner for each territory and they would each specialize in that territory. Now, I think we're seeing that a lot less nowadays. And instead, people lean on specialist marketing and promotional agencies or third parties or platforms to start targeting that such. And I think it's important to work out what those territories are that are going to be most relevant to you. And also, if you have one that you're in already that is performing pretty well, like what does the next step look like there? How do you get it to the next level? And is that a partnerships conversation with DSPs? Is that a setting the baseline and doing more activations to increase your digital footprint? I'm old school. I like a mailing list. You know what I mean? I like being able to segment audiences and see how they react to things and working out what makes one audience member, a really high value audience member compared to somebody a bit more passive. I hate the term super fan, but I think the general mentality around that conversation is completely right, because now more than ever, these passive audiences that we've been building on Spotify and these sort of anonymous numbers that we see on the public little bracket and such, they don't really move the needle anymore. And especially when it comes to then converting to things like ticket sales and merchandising and the stuff that's higher ticket when it comes to a revenue perspective, we need direct access to those people. We need direct pushes to that. And again, I think as you get bigger as an artist, getting that right just becomes more and more tangible from a revenue perspective. And constantly I'm looking to see that, right, if this is working, how do we add another zero to that revenue? How do we take it to the next step? Because sure, something just staying the same, if it's good money, it's good money. And I'd also argue that sometimes people just don't want to upset a good thing. And there's absolute merit in that as well. Don't get me wrong, but you need to be escalating. I think you also need to be moving with the times. Technology changes so quickly. We see this now with, just the invention or the sort of rise of UGC versus now the AI debate and conversation, and how that has sort of both empowered and enslaved, let's say, in various walks. And so being willing to stay on top of the new mediums, but then also not just leaning into one platform at any given time. And I see people doing this all the time, when
I was going to ask about that.
We're going to be the TikTok label. Like, well, okay, but do you need to be the TikTok label? Or can you be the label that uses TikTok really well for this purpose, but then also has this platform doing its thing and this platform doing its thing? And even since prior to joining TikTok, when I had my first company, Unapologetic Group, I was always for parity across platforms. And if we were working really closely with Spotify, I wanted to know what the conversation with Apple Music looked like. And I wanted to understand what we could do with Deezer and what we could do eventually with like Amazon Music and such, because that is what makes up the global ecosystem, right? It's not and it shouldn't be just one platform. And anecdotally speaking, I'm really happy that this fuss about TikTok being banned has somewhat died down. And it looks like that for now, touch wood, it will remain undisturbed and available in the United States of America. That said, there were several people at the time who I was talking to and going through their audience analytics, turning around to them and saying, hey, if TikTok had been banned in the US, you would have lost upwards of 80% of your total audience overnight. Now, that is a huge problem. And, I'll flip that. What if that ever happened to Spotify and you've built your entire audience base on that platform, let alone the fact that even if you're an independent and you've built your entire audience base on that platform and you now have to give them 30% of revenue to be opted into discovery mode to get algorithmic preference as it is. Like, we need to be on all of these platforms. We need to be doing our bit with all of these platforms, but I don't think you can afford in the modern market to just specialize in one platform personally. And I hate to see that.
And I'm glad you said that. And I think that comes back to email marketing that you were talking about earlier. I love that you brought that up because email marketing is something that anybody can really learn and get the hang of. How MailChimp is easy enough to figure out, whatever the other, whatever you decide to use. That's something that you can teach yourself over time, and owning your audience. And like you said, segmenting them and figuring out who responds to what. That is how you make more money, because streaming is not going to do it for you. It's the merch, it's the shows, it's the communities if you have a Patreon. And so platform dependability, you can be, even if a platform isn't banned, you could just be deplatformed. They could just take your account away because they've, for one reason or another, it could be an error, whatever. I don't work at TikTok, but that is something that's always top of mind for me as a creator too, that it's so important to own your audience.
Well, exactly. And I think you make a really good point there. You can learn email marketing. There are so many resources. I feel the same about digital advertising as well, to be honest. As great as it is to have access to awesome agencies who make it so much simpler, which, I'm lucky enough to have that. But, you can learn the basics of that. You can learn the basics of these different advertising formats, be it YouTube or, through Meta Business Suite and such. And I think if you do have to DIY it, you do have the opportunity to fill that gap and to do it yourself quite tangibly. I think nowadays, like, sure, it's work, and if you don't like learning new skills, then that's going to be a bit of a hard grind. But until you have that sort of team around you, that's the best possible option, and there's no excuse anymore. You can do a 1 hour masterclass on YouTube and come away pretty much level in an industry standard. And how great's that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so let's talk about the timeline for planning a release. You mentioned earlier that attention spans are short, but if you were going to work with an artist, let's just, make someone up from scratch. There's an artist, they have a release. What is the general time, or is there no general timeline? Everybody's different.
Everybody's different. I use Drake often as an example because he is very good at just dropping new music. No warning, no nothing. Now, when you've got as many monthly listeners and social media follows and like such demand for your product as he does, that works. When you're coming up and you don't quite have that autonomy yet, it's different. And everybody's scared, I think, of kind of Noah's Ark syndrome, where it's like, if I build it, will they come? And I think we need to get away from this sort of anxiety-ridden journey from delivering music to the day it's released. And I generally say there are some really good vehicles for, pre-release marketing. I think pre-saves, they have a place, right? They're good. They're good to start getting an algorithmic sort of pattern ticking. They're good for, data capture as well and such. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I don't think people have the attention span to remember that a release is coming. And so as a result, I think you're far better off telling people closer to the release so that at least you can capture their attention and turn that into something tangible, e.g. active streams and people actually consuming the music, actually sharing the music, actually using the music in their own UGC. And this is why I generally prefer smaller lead times in. I think I generally work to the rule that you want 2, maybe 3 weeks pre-release, and then sustained 5 weeks post-release. And what I mean by that is I think you should have intentional activations scheduled throughout that 5 weeks, be that content, be that activations with platforms and partners, be that direct to consumer stuff, be that audience development stuff. You need to have that sort of mapped out and ready to go. And then also you need to be ready to completely rip up that plan if one thing starts over indexing or something goes so well and beyond your anticipation, and you can react to that as well. And quite often I think people almost catch themselves unprepared for success sometimes in that respect, in that they blow through all of their content in the first week, then week 2 that energy isn't sustained, the platforms that they use aren't quite as well populated by week 3. So right, what's happening? Nothing. Okay, so even if somebody is discovering your music, they're going to your channel. Let's use Instagram as an example. They're going to your Instagram. You haven't posted anything since last week, and that was just you saying, hey, this is still out, go and stream it. You've lost the opportunity to actually earn a fan at that point, because they've gone, again, to see what's happening. And this is where lifestyle content, narrative content, behind the scenes content, live performance content, there are so many options, and it doesn't just have to be this very dry, boring lip sync style content, which, just to be clear, if people do that and it works for them, nothing against it. You've got to do what works for you, right? And I think there are great pop artists who really do that, and it performs incredibly well for them. For me, though, I feel like a lot of people feel like they have to do it because everyone else is doing it. And I think there are just so many options nowadays for how that can look.
There's something that I've noticed, a trend more so on TikTok, but on Instagram too. And artists like Clooney have been doing it for years, but then I've seen smaller artists, like there's this really great producer, DJ, OK Val, did this with a recent track of hers where they pick the best parts, the drop, it's whatever, and then they're just playing that over and over and over. Clooney with his live performances, he did it with Stephanie. Now that song, it wasn't out. He was playing it at his shows, but for his online audience, he was just playing the drop. And then OK Val, up to her releasing this track, was just playing it in her living room or her studio or out on a walk or whatever. And she did that for 2-3 weeks. And then whether the date was actually picked or not, she said, should I drop this? Should I drop this? Okay, I decided I'm going to drop it on March 19th or whatever it was. And I have seen that work really well for artists on the front end. But then what you're talking about, once it's out, and I don't know, I would love to hear your opinion on this. I feel like there's some fatigue after hearing the drop or hearing the track so many times. And then people are like, okay, just release it already. Like I'm getting bored of this. And then it's out. And then it's just like a steady, drop off after that.
Yeah, I think there's nothing worse, right, than when somebody announces a forthcoming announcement. And I think sometimes it can have the same effect when you're teasing a release too much, because eventually, even with the most active fan base, eventually they're just going to say, come on, give it to us already. And I think it's easy to fall into that. Now, I understand that you want to create anticipation. And this is where I generally think, and working across multiple projects now in different genres and, with different focused markets and such, that 2 to 3 week window, I think it's enough. If we broke it down and said, right, week 1, we're just going to say that the new music is coming and here's your first opportunity to pre-save it, right? Week 2, right, here's more of an actual sort of insight as to what this record sounds like and what it's about. Week 3, here's the narrative. Here's why you should care about this record that's coming out. And then it's there, right? That's enough. I'd almost say that's too long, personally, because if I'm thinking about from my perspective, if you've caught somebody on that first week, you've got to keep them waiting for 3 weeks. And even if they've pre-saved it, you're not then guaranteed that they are going to go back. They're going to spot it when it does come out. I mean, it's getting easier now. I like the way that Apple Music especially has built it in so that you can go and sort of, for an album, for example, you can go and add an album, and then even if 1 or 2 singles are the only ones out, every time a new single comes out, that album goes right back up to the top of your releases, goes back up. And, again, there are ways to still capture the audience in that respect, but it's too easy to get, promotional fatigue in that respect. And I think stacking your cards for when the record is out, it just makes more sense because you want that. You want to make it as easy as possible for your audience to discover the music and go and consume it. And why keep your own success in that respect?
Yeah, it's almost like a joke that's been taken too far where you're like, okay, all right, like we get it. You know, that's kind of how I've viewed this strategy that I've seen recently. But when it is that short amount of time, like I feel like Chris Lake did this recently with his Toxic track. I feel like he only did that for like 2 weeks and he put it out. And so it's like, I didn't think about this before you said it, but that really is the sweet spot to not, fatigue and frustrate your audience. One thing I've noticed too that I've actually participated in before as an influencer on TikTok and whatnot, a lot of artists, some of the ones that I work with are like, well, I don't want to be on camera that many times. I just can't think of enough content that involves me to promote this. That's not repetitive. So one thing that I've seen other artists do, whether it's filtered through agencies or labels, or it's more of a grassroots thing, is artists reach out to content creators and say, hey, can you either use this track in your content just as background music? You don't have to reference it at all. Or can you make a piece of content that kind of encapsulates what the track is about, whether it's like a love story or, like a party or whatever. Artists can do that for pretty cheap because you can even just reach out to people who are smaller creators but have an engaged audience and be like, hey, this is my new track. If you ever feel like using it in one of your videos, one of your pieces of content. And if you do that at scale, I think there's a lot of benefit there.
Definitely. I mean, and this is something I looked into in great depth while I was at TikTok. And I think something like, and I'm just citing the UK market here, but I think something like 70 to 75% of trending records originated from micro influencer impacts and, building through that. It wasn't just one, a couple of big macro influencers coming in and blowing the record up. If anything, they would come in and be used once you'd already sort of validated a trend. And I think micro influencers for me are one of the best byproducts, I would argue, of the TikTok era for music promotion and such, because as you say, you have this opportunity, and I almost call it sort of civilian marketing. And what I mean by that is like you're taking the record and putting it in real relatable contexts. Like I can't relate to some supermodel with 2.4 million followers on TikTok who's on a private yacht with a sheikh or something like that, right? Yeah. Dancing with a bottle of champagne to a record. I hope one day I can aspire to that lifestyle, but right now that ain't it, right? However, what I can vibe to is people in my local community actually fucking with the record, or somebody sat with their friends, sunset in the background, consuming this record, and that time and that place and the record together. It's like, it's almost like filmmaking in that respect. I look at these things as like we're creating these micro scenes. And this is honestly as well, just from an A&R perspective, this is sometimes how I work out if a record's ready. I'll put my headphones in, I'll walk around. I have this route to my office where I walk across Blackfriars Bridge, right? And from Blackfriars Bridge, you can see all the way down the River Thames. If it's sunrise or sunset, that's my test. If the record passes the sunrise sunset test, I feel like, right, this could be a piece of content. I feel like it's getting there. And I think those sort of moments, that's how people should be thinking, because you can recontextualize that whole sort of approach to so many different genres, to different backgrounds, different audiences. And that's kind of the magic of it, I think.
That's such amazing advice. I was just having this conversation with a friend and who's an event producer yesterday, because I make videos for him to promote his events and kind of like tell the story of it. And he was talking about another friend who does use those macro influencer, high follower accounts to promote his events. And I'm like, but those people don't even live in Chicago. So like, I don't understand. Like, there's so much value in just connecting with other creators. It's not just that the macro influencers can't relate to the listener's lifestyle. They're most likely not going to be able to relate to the artist's lifestyle. So how can they get that track across in a way that's just authentic? So I think that going the micro influencer route is something that's so overlooked, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, even with myself. about how algorithms work? Do you think that artists just don't necessarily understand that like bigger isn't always better?
I think the biggest misconception about algorithms is that they aren't very much at the mercy of boosting in one way or another. I think so much unorganic activity is attributed to being organic to the extent where people just don't actually know what is and isn't paid anymore. And I think that's a problem, to be honest. And I think this, you can skin it so many different ways. Spotify, discovery mode, TikTok, Spark ads, creator marketing, like, Instagram, sure. Usually it will tell you if it's sponsored or anything like that, but there are other ways that aren't as clear. And so, algorithms, they're at the mercy of consumer behavior too, right? And you can only, as an individual artist or a record label, you can only influence consumer behavior so much. The rest of the industry that it's taking from, all the different territories that it's taking from, all the different sort of touch points it's taking from. TikTok is a wonderful example, right? There is a internal metric called the follow-up publish rate, which is not publicly available to users. What it tracks is if a creator created a piece of content using a piece of music, how many other creators did that one post inspire? Right? And so if you have one creator who uses a record, and because of their post and people clicking through their post to the sound on TikTok, if that one post has had 1,000, let's say, additional creations, the algorithm goes, look, that is a really valuable piece of content. Now, I've been out of TikTok nearly a year now, so it could well be that things have changed, nuances have changed. To me, and looking at what does and doesn't work still, that seems to still be a very relevant metric. And I think, sure, we don't have access to that metric publicly, but we can start thinking, we can reverse engineer that and go like, right, what brief can we give these creators that is going to make other people want to use the record? What is relatable enough to get other people using it? And I think a superpower right now is, instead of going cap in hand, expecting to hit the magical viral, benchmarks and whatever, just utilize your audience in a way where you can incentivize them to actually be part of that and to create UGC for you without having to pay them. Find another way to reward them for that sort of transaction, let's say. And that is so much more sustainable than having to drop 5, 10, 20K every time you want to start building that sort of momentum. And I think it's just also important to remember your competition probably has more money than you, right? I feel like that your competition is probably Dua Lipa's whole team at Warner, right? Or, all these different things that come together behind the scenes that you don't know about. And you could be watching somebody grow thinking, oh my God, they're doing so much better than me. How they're spending more money, or they have a partner that they can lean on that has that leverage. And then no record label is equal, right? The majors have their own relationships with these platforms. Different indies and distributors have different relationships with these platforms, different access. Some labels are given free ad credits at these platforms versus, DIY distributors who you really just upload the music and then it's on the artists and individuals to promote those records. So you can't make any assumptions that anything's truly organic. And show me a properly organic example, and I bet you will find one or two paid routes that they took to get there.
Wow. I think that's so important for people. It's something that even I forget as someone who's been in this game for a while, and I have a marketing agency, and I'll examine, well, why did this content do well? It's not that great. And there's a lot of different levers that are pulled that, that's why they say follow the money, right? So
Exactly that. But then also, once in a while, something will just over-index. And that's where you've also got to be ready. So like, if something does over-index and you want to sustain it, you've got to be ready to spend enough money to then sustain it, because what goes up must come down, right? It's a tale as old as time.
Yeah, that's really relatable for me right now. A piece of content that I created in February went so viral, completely unexpected. And it's not just the money, it's the pressure to deliver again, which is something I think every artist can relate to, whether it's, a track that did really well, whatever it is. Once you hit that level, the pressure to stay there or better is really high. So what emerging trends in music marketing are you seeing for this year?
I'm seeing a lot of people gravitate towards sort of like fan community platforms. Definitely. I think there's a few different variations popping up. I'm seeing a lot more people leveraging the likes of, Discord, for example, to like bring their audiences into one place. There's a great emerging platform in Sweden at the moment called Smash that again are giving people like, I would say like sort of an OnlyFans equivalent kind of model, but very much tailored to music, which is great because you look at what OnlyFans has done for its respective market, right? There isn't really a music savvy version of that. I don't think Patreon is great, but for music purposes, not so much. Bandcamp is still really a sales platform above all else and such. So I'm seeing more and more people trying to fill that gap. And I think that's great because I think if you can find a place where you can keep your most responsive audience and the ones that are willing to fund you directly rather than just being a passive listener on Spotify and, you pray that they pay for Spotify. And so as a result, their streams are worth more than say like somebody who can still listen with the adverts, which I think should be illegal. I don't think there should be a free tier for any of these things. I think at this stage that's inexcusable. So we should be moving away from that as well. That's not a marketing conversation. That's just a moral conversation, I think, and a value conversation. And I think as well, people are just having very honest conversations about whether something is or isn't right for them. And I welcome that. And I think we're getting out of this phase of just blindly jumping on trends, which I welcome because you've alluded to it earlier. What works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another person. And similarly, I hate this idea that we have to put, or people would be putting a gun to an artist's head, say, hey, you've got to do content like this. You've got to market like this. There's no excuse with the platforms and the different nuances they have in terms of the content formats and how those things generally roll out to audiences. There's spaces for everybody to trial and error and build their own marketing autonomy. And I really don't think there's an excuse to be forcing people to do cringe content that just doesn't feel legitimate to them. And so I like to think we're moving away from that. And I just hope we're getting to a stage where we stop treating music like popcorn. I just, music's caviar to me. It's gold. Like we shouldn't be just throwing it on the floor at a cinema. It should be, treated as such. It should be marketed as such, and it should be done with dignity. And I think more than ever, there are some people who can be a bit more comedic in their marketing presence and such. And I respect that. I get that. If that works for them, awesome. But I don't know. I also think music itself and the cultures behind music, they deserve the dignity of sort of like having their story told, having control of their own narrative, actually being able to tell their audience what it's about, why it's relevant to them. And yeah, I just think the closer we get to that and that sort of ecosystem, the more longevity we're going to give to music and for marketing as a superpower for music to win.
I love that analogy. Music isn't popcorn, it's caviar. I think that's the most original quote I've heard on this podcast. I love it. So if artists, this is my last question for you. If artists that are listening have a limited budget, what is the most impactful marketing activity they could focus on right now until they get some capital under their belt?
It's a good question. I think building your audience doesn't cost money. Building your audience is as simple as turning up, working out who you want your audience to be, and creating content or creating channels that allow you to communicate to them. And I think you can start so simple there. You start with the base channels that everyone has access to. You work out what works best for you, what doesn't work for you. And then you start siphoning off a certain percentage of that audience to be your elected, let's call them super fans, as much as I hate that term, and such, and start using them as the folks that you can test the water with. I also think a real superpower right now is fan accounts, because what I love about fan accounts is while you protect your own brand values on your main channels, fan accounts, they can be throwaway. You can trial and error that, and if it doesn't work, it's not directly attributed to you. It's attributed elsewhere. And I think a lot of people are using fan accounts really well to get sort of like ideas ticking, or at least validating them before they then start translating them over to their actual main accounts and such. And so that's a good place to start. I also think digital advertising, that offers a certain level of transparency. You can see what does and doesn't work. You can see how your targeting is actually translating and converting. You can control how much or little you do spend there. And you can start very simple there as well, I think. So getting your audience segments right from a digital advertising perspective, having those sort of like almost side funnels like your fan accounts or like your community pages and such, I think that's a good place to start. And then owning as much access to UGC creation as possible. Because if you can create a world in which you can get several hundred people using your records in their own short form content rather than having to buy it or pay for it, the privilege of that, then you're going to save a fortune, really, because you can be spending thousands of pounds to get the exact same outcomes.
Wow.
Or sorry, thousands of dollars, I should say.
It's amazing. This has been such a valuable conversation. I've learned a lot, and I know my audience will really appreciate it. So thank you for taking the time.
Hey, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
What an incredible conversation. And that Shermanology case study alone is worth its weight in gold. A record rejected by major labels that became their second highest streaming track ever, with 100% ownership retained. That's the difference between following conventional wisdom and applying the principles Dan outlines. And I am the biggest Shermanology fan ever. If you guys don't follow me on social media, I mean, I post about this pretty constantly. Like, I'm their number one fan. I spent my birthday at their Spy Bar set. I love them. So this story just really tickled my fancy. Before we wrap up, guys, I'm excited to announce a contest to win a pass to Chicago Music Nexus 2025. I posted this on my Instagram a few weeks ago, but there's still some time to enter. So here's how to do it. You got to create a 60-second video explaining your artist brand, which includes your unique sound, your target audience, your value proposition, and the industry challenge you're tackling in 2025. You got to upload your submission to the Dropbox link in the show notes by May 9th. And listen, I'm not looking for high production value. Don't care if you don't have a mic, a ring light. Like, don't sit in front of a window, right? So you're all backlit. Do some basic stuff so I can really see you and hear you clearly, but it doesn't need to be crazy. Just clarity of vision and purpose. That's what I want to see. The winner will be announced during episode 100, which is coming up in just a few weeks on May 22nd. And the prize, like I said, is a pass to Chicago Music Nexus 2025, which is happening on November 22nd. It's an amazing opportunity to connect with industry leaders and like-minded artists in person. We sold out last year. We will sell out again this year. Pre-sale is happening later in May. So why don't you just skip pre-sale and win a pass instead? Remember, success in dance music isn't about luck. It's about strategy. I'll talk to you next week.